That young woman in Afghanistan who the Taliban, wanted to keep out of school, uh, is now a quantum computing researcher at Tufts University.
I think every kid needs to hear this story.
You don't you don't try to compare any new thing to some absolute perfection. You can compare it to what's already out there.
I think if they ban it, they're going to deprive their students of one of the maybe most effective research, collaborative, creative tools. Hey everyone, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and thrilled to bring you the third episode of NTLF Conversations. Today, I'm very excited because we have the absolute privilege of hosting a visionary educator whose impact on global education is nothing sort of extraordinary. He's the founder of Khan Academy, an organization that we all know. It has revolutionized the way we learn, breaking down barriers, bringing knowledge to millions worldwide. What I personally find fascinating about the Khan Academy and about Sal Khan, our guest for today, is his vision and how he has harnessed the power of technology to reimagine education. And that's what we want to talk about today, especially given the raging debate about AI and education. On one hand, there's growing concern about its misuse or potential misuse. Will it create a generation of people who are so dependent on technology that they can't think for themselves? That's a question I get asked very often. Will it make teachers redundant? And on the other hand, on the flip side, there's talk about tremendous promise. Will it reimagine education and ways we learn, like we could have ever imagined? Will it boost teacher efficiency and productivity, making it much more impactful, making the role much more meaningful? So there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to talk about. And no one better than Sal to help us unpack this debate and help us give both sides of the coin, give a perspective on both sides of the coin. So, Sal, welcome to Nasscom. Thrilled that you could take the time to have this conversation. Um, and welcome to NTLF Conversations, where we talk about all things AI. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I'm going to kick it right off. First question, I want to start with your belief in personalized tutoring as the pinnacle of education, or I think you call it the gold standard. Talk a little bit more about it and why do you think this is the game changer? Um, what's the magic about personal tutoring? I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, and the roots of personal tutoring go well before any form of technology, Khan Academy, generative AI, or anything. If you were to go back, let's say 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, very few people got an education because it tended to be pretty expensive. But the few that did, usually if you were a prince, a future king, a future emperor, you got a very good education. Usually you had a personal tutor or an army of personal tutors who would essentially personalize the education to you. Famously, Alexander the Great, 2,300 years ago, had Aristotle as his personal tutor. And you can imagine Aristotle working with young Alexander. And if Alexander's having trouble with a certain concept, the Aristotle would have slowed down. This kid's going to be future emperor. We got to make sure he understands accounting or military strategy. And if Alexander doesn't have any further questions and he shows that he's mastered something, no reason to waste his time. He has a lot to learn, need to move ahead. So that was always actually the norm in human education for most of human history. You fast forward to about 200 or 300 years ago, and there was a very utopian idea. Let's bring education to everyone, free mass public education. And it started in countries like England, the United States, Japan, Germany. And it's not a coincidence that the first countries that introduced mass public education were also some of the first countries to really industrialize, to have a broad-based middle class. But in order to do that, in order to have mass public education, they had to make some compromises. You couldn't afford every student to have Alexander the Great as your tutor, or even to have a tutor, period. So they borrowed tools from the Industrial Revolution, which was also happening at the same time, and said, all right, well, let's batch students together into cohorts of 25, 30, 35 students. Let's move them all at the same pace, try to cover, quote, standards. We'll give them some lecture, some homework. Every 2, 3, 4 weeks, we'll give them an assessment. And based on that assessment, if let's say one student gets 100, great. If another student gets an 80% or 70%, too bad. The assembly line has to keep moving, so to speak. And that has essentially been the education system that we all grew up with. It's the same education system that exists today. And what typically happens, and you see this especially in subjects like math and science, but you pretty much see it everywhere, is those gaps. If you didn't know 20% of the material on, say, decimals, and then the next unit is on word problems with decimals, or now you're going to be multiplying decimals or dividing decimals, there's no way you're going to be able to master those more advanced concepts if you didn't understand 20% of the more basic one. And despite that somewhat obvious piece of logic, the system just keeps moving forward. And you have a lot of students who fall through the cracks, hit walls when they get to an algebra class or trigonometry class, because those classes assume that you have fluency in arithmetic, assume you have fluency in pre-algebra, and a lot of folks don't. And historically, the way that educated families, families with more resources have handled this is they've gotten personal tutors for their kids, so that if their kids only understand 80% of the material, those tutors can make sure that you can go back and fill those gaps. So that's always been the norm in society, even if we didn't call it out that way. And then in my own journey, I kind of saw the same thing. A lot of folks know Khan Academy started with me tutoring my cousins remotely back in 2004. And I saw the same pattern. The reason why they were struggling wasn't because they weren't bright, wasn't because they didn't have good teachers. It was because they forgot 20% of the material in fifth grade, 30% of the material in sixth grade, and now all of a sudden they're in an algebra class and they're struggling. And so having me as their personal tutor, I was able to go back, help them refresh things, fill in any gaps. And when I did that with my cousins, all of them were able to just, become superstars in math. And so a lot of what Khan Academy has been attempting to do over the last over 10 years is, can we now use online tools to start approximating that personalization, that mastery-based learning? Mastery-based learning is just a fancy word for always having the opportunity, the incentive to fill in any gaps you have. Don't just keep moving on if you have some real gaps. And for the last 10 plus years, we've been working with classrooms around the world and independent learners around the world to start to approximate some of what a tutor could do. Now, I don't think that's a replacement for a human tutor. It's always going to be great to have a human connection, someone also who's holding you accountable and filling in gaps. But most folks don't have access to a one-on-one tutor every day, all the time, on demand. I'm sure even Aristotle had some time off. Well, where young Alexander might have had some questions. And so that's where I think pre-generative AI technology, you can do a lot with on-demand video, with personalized practice and feedback like Khan Academy already has. And then generative AI might be able to take us to another level.
Absolutely. I grew up in a family with a lot of elder brothers, a typical in-joint Indian family. So this personalized tutoring is something I have experienced at every stage of my life, because they were nerds. They loved science and math, and my love for science comes from them. It's because they made me love it, and it was not the classroom, but it was those interactions I would have with them. So I completely believe in that. But let's dig a little deeper, Sal, and let's talk about India specifically. Now, India, as you well know, is a country with very diverse demographics, right? A large percentage of our population lives in rural India, where you may not have access to the best technology or even the best connectivity. It's a scenario of limited resources, right? Does this vision play out in these kind of scenarios? And if not, what can be done to make it truly inclusive? Because there's such a powerful vision.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am optimistic that it will eventually play out in these scenarios, but there are some real hurdles, like you mentioned. To use Khan Academy, it's predicated on having a reasonable internet connection. It's predicated on having some access to a device. When we started, Khan Academy really became an organization back in 2008, 2009, 2010. Then especially in places like India, it was very device access, even electricity access in certain parts of India were not happening. But over the last 10 plus years, especially with the pandemic, especially with smartphones getting dramatically cheaper and cellular data plans getting dramatically cheaper over the last decade, it's a lot more in reach than it was. And so, if we can make something that for the most of human history, education, it's been very scarce, it's been very expensive. And if we can put it on the same adoption curve as smartphones and internet, then I think we're going to be in good shape. And already there's a lot of folks in India who don't have access to a great education, who could use extra support, and they have internet access and they have smartphones or some type of device. We can start supporting those folks today, and then hopefully over the next decade we can get to that last mile in those rural areas.
I really hope that happens. And it might need a little bit of a different model. For example, one of the things that has really worked well in taking technology to rural infrastructure in India are these concepts of common technology centers. So you may not have great access in your home, but you come to a center and you get that access. And, how do we leverage these to get education, healthcare, government services to the last mile? Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about AI. Your advocacy of integrating AI in education has garnered immense attention. There's a lot of there are a lot of questions. There's a lot of good thoughts, and there are a lot of skeptics too. And we'd love to hear directly from you about why you're such a strong believer. What are some of the compelling use cases that you're seeing, which is already transforming education? And also, what are some of the risks? Everyone talks about risks. What are the risks you see that you think we should be mindful of when embracing AI in education?
Yeah, at a very high level, these technologies, generative AI, they're already being used in the workplace. They're going to be used in society. They're going to influence political elections. They're out there, and arguably one or several of the reasons we educate students. It's not the only reasons, but one of the reasons is to prepare them for being adults and being able to participate in the workforce. And so if students are going to end up using this in the workforce, and this is already happening, you definitely don't want to shelter them from it for
Yeah.
while they're in education. If anything, you should expose them to it, have them understand how it can be used and how it shouldn't be used. With that said, there are issues with it. As you know, famously, Chat GPT, which was not built for education, it can write essays, it can do problem sets, but when you do use it that way, it can also hallucinate facts. It's infamously bad at mathematics. So it had some real issues. This past year, about a year ago, we got into an NDA with OpenAI as they were finishing up their training run of GPT-4, and they reached out to us because they felt that GPT-4, no one expected actually that Chat GPT built on GPT 3.5 was going to catch on the way it did. The OpenAI folks assumed that GPT-4 was going to be the one that really captures people's imagination in both a good way, but it also might be a little bit frightening for folks. And so they wanted to lead with social positive use cases, and they saw education and healthcare as the main two. And so they immediately called us and said, hey, is there something that we might be able to do together? And I was skeptical at first. I'd been paying close attention to what GPT-2 and GPT-3 could do, and they were fascinating, but
Yeah.
they could make up a lot, and they didn't really
Yeah.
handle knowledge or logic. But that first weekend in, I think it was August, that I had access to GPT-4, I realized, and our team realized, that this is different. That you could really steer it to take on personas, to act like a tutor, to drive a conversation, not to just be a kind of call and response that many people are familiar with Chat GPT. And I always have been working on Khan Academy as something that could maybe scale what I used to do with my cousin Nadia, that we could maybe scale. And, all we had access to at the time, on-demand video, exercises and immediate feedback, dashboards for teachers. But when we started to see what's possible with GPT-4, and if we put extra layers to give it more guardrails, like safety guardrails so that parents and teachers could monitor usage, moderation guardrails. We have a second AI that monitors the conversations, actively notifies parents and teachers if it's going into a shady place. We have a bunch of layers to improve the mathematics far beyond what GPT-4 by itself does. We anchor those experiences on the information in Khan Academy, so we've reduced hallucinations dramatically. We're trying to do a lot of digital literacy here because these are not going to be perfect. But I would say even if you're sitting in a lecture hall, not everything that comes out of the professor's mouth, sometimes they make mistakes too. And it's good for anyone to get information to always be skeptical or be able to
Yeah.
cross-reference it. So those are the types of things we're putting in place. In terms of risks, the bias, the misinformation, et cetera, it's there. And the risks of cheating, they're there. And there's ways that we think we can mitigate it. But I always try to remind folks that you don't try to compare any new thing to some absolute perfection. You can compare it to what's already out there. And we know the internet is already full of misinformation. If you do a web search, the first 5 things you're going to see are ads. The next 5 things are going to be people who are great at search engine optimization and not necessarily the most credible organizations. If you go on social media, we have previous generations of AI whose objective function is just to keep you watching. And unfortunately, that usually means something that triggers you, something that reinforces your own biases, oftentimes intentional misinformation. And if that's the status quo, I'm actually confident that generative AI is actually already better than social media and the wild internet. But that's not to mean that we can just ignore these problems. We should put guardrails, but I feel confident in a lot of ways it's going to be a more sensible place to learn and study than the wild west of the internet.
I actually agree with you a lot on that, and that's something I've been talking to government, etc., about. But when you're talking about mitigating risks, how much of it can be solved by pure engineering power, and how much of it will actually need institutes or governments or whoever to come in and regulate? For example, you've come out with Canmigo, if I get it, if I'm not
Right.
mispronouncing it right, which is the education, I'm assuming GPT version of it. Um, can it, well, if a student asks it to just write out its answer, can it say no? And can it work with the student to co-create the answer, for example? Because that can be done by engineering, I'm guessing. And if guardrails have to be set, any advice for institutions, educational institutions, because a lot of them are going down the path of we ban this. I think if they ban it, they're going to deprive their students of one of the maybe most effective research, collaborative, creative tools that's been invented in our times. So what's your advice to institutes?
Yeah, so what we've done with Conmigo, the generative AI that we launched alongside GPT-4, if you ask it, tell me the answer, it won't tell you the answer. It'll ask leading questions. It acts in a Socratic way. We have activities where it'll help you do things like write essays, give you feedback on it, but it won't write the essay for you. And the way that we
Fantastic.
see humanities classes evolving, or even any type of assignment, is teachers working with the AI, working with Conmigo to construct assignments, to construct grading rubrics, to make the assignment. Then the AI works with the student on the assignment. Hey, let's brainstorm a thesis statement together. Let's make an outline. I'm going to give you some feedback on what you've written and even give you a preliminary assessment. Hey, based on the rubric, I'd give this a B minus right now. And then when the AI reports back to the teacher, which we're building right now, this isn't science fiction, it can expose the whole process to the teacher. It can say, look, we worked on this for 4 hours. First, we found a thesis statement, then we changed it, then we had an outline, etc. And if a student goes to ChatGPT and just asks ChatGPT to write the essay and then copies and pastes that into Conmigo, Conmigo will tell the teacher, hey, I don't know where this essay came from. We didn't work on this together. This just showed up. And so that's a pretty good indication to the
That's
teacher
fantastic.
to scrutinize that.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. And anything from an educational institute perspective that you think they should be thinking about?
I think you're going to have 3 modes. For something like writing, you're going to have one mode where maybe for shorter assignments, you're going to want to do it in the classroom. I'm sure people are already doing that because of ChatGPT, and they're definitely going to do it that this coming fall. I think there's another mode at the other extreme where you tell students, look, use whatever tools you want. Use ChatGPT, use any tool, because that's kind of the real world. But I expect more from you. I'm actually going to push you so that you have to really use these tools. You have to use these tools to create models, to write a bigger document, to create your spreadsheet, to make a movie, whatever it might be. And then I think that intermediary mode of, hey, I want you to write a term paper and I want it to be your paper. That's where I think Conmigo is going to be really valuable. And it's going to be able to act as a writing coach and report back to the teacher on the whole process, not just the final outcome.
Are our students going to be able to access it in India?
We're working on that as we speak. We have a handful of students in India already using it.
Oh,
Uh, one of them, a few of them are go to this Khan World School, which it's an online high school that we have. based out of, but a few of the students are in India. But in the coming months, I would expect we're probably about 3 or 4 months away that we're going to make it generally available around the world.
Oh, fantastic. Can't wait. Um, I really want to, before we wrap it up, I want to hear one story from you. And it's my favorite story about Khan Academy. It's the story of Sultana. I've read about it. It gives me goosebumps every time I even think about it. And that's about changing lives, right? That's about, when we think about reimagining education, nothing talks to me better or more effectively than what she did with her life. So tell us a little bit about how that happened and how you came to know about it.
Yeah, so this young girl, I believe she must have been 12 or 13 when the story starts. She's in Afghanistan. Taliban keeps her from going to school. Her brothers are able to, but she's just at home doing chores. She really wants to get educated. She first wants to learn English, and I believe an uncle gets her a copy of Time magazine just for her to practice her English.
Mm.
And in it, there was an article about Khan Academy, and she says, "This is what I need." And so she goes on Khan Academy. She's fortunate; she had an internet connection, she had a device, and her
Mm.
family was supportive of it. So that goes a long way. Um, she was doing 10 hours of chores a day, but then at night, when everyone slept, she would do 2 or 3 hours of Khan Academy. And she
Wow.
went from, an early elementary level of education. She says a big moment for her was when she realized she's learning much more than her brothers at the Taliban controlled schools. I told her that's not a high bar, but they he eventually, using Khan Academy, learns algebra and calculus and trigonometry and physics and chemistry, biology. She decides that she wants to become a physicist and do research in the United States. She hears about the SAT and it's not offered in Afghanistan. She's
Mm.
able to convince her parents to let her visit family members in Pakistan to take the SAT where it was available. She goes, and for someone and now by this point I think she's 17 or 18 years old, so she's been on Khan Academy for like 6 or 7 years at this point.
Wow.
She does shockingly well for someone who has no real formal education, completely self-taught in English, self-taught in math and science. And then she's trying to come to the US, and this is when I found out about her. Someone she met on the internet contacted me, and it was hard for her to get into the US, and because most universities wanted a high school diploma, they couldn't really
Yeah.
make sense of what she was doing. But then eventually Arizona State University said, we'll take a chance on her, and so they gave her admission. She was able to get her student visa, and that young woman in Afghanistan who the Taliban wanted to keep out of school uh, is now a quantum computing researcher at Tufts University.
I think every kid needs to hear this story. This is where, dreams, no matter how big, they're absolutely possible. They're within your reach. It's just so inspiring. And Sal, my last question to you, as you look towards the future, the possibilities that it holds, the possibilities that we are seeing technology hold in education, especially, what's your vision of the future of education and the future of education, the future of educators, um, and just how this entire landscape will evolve?
Big question. I could answer it for a very long time. I think there's really two worlds, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think there's worlds where students don't have access to a lot. Maybe they're in a village in rural India, where there might not be anyone in the village who can even teach algebra, especially at a high level. And for those students, I imagine the future. I mean, to some degree, it's already true, but definitely in 5 or 10 years, they are going to be able to use Khan Academy and Khanmigo, the generative AI, to learn at their own time and pace, and master concepts, and eventually using Khan Academy get internationally recognized credit for the work that they do. And this is something that we're working on as well: high school and college credits for their work, and recognition eventually that employers will take it seriously. And some students are just going to they'll be motivated enough to do it on their own, but most students are going to need support. So that's where maybe these village center type community center things might be really valuable, where there might not be someone in the village who knows calculus, but they can support the
Yeah.
students. They can take care of the center, etc. Now the ideal is students have access to an amazing classroom, and there we think we can really help raise the ceiling. Every teacher on the planet I think would love having a teaching assistant or several teaching assistants to help them grade papers, to help them create lesson plans, to help them address student questions because they can't get to all 30 students in the classroom. We think generative AI and Conmigo is going to play that role. And then for the students, if they're stuck, there's someone or something that they can always talk to, but it's connected to what they're doing in class. So they can answer their question, maybe a question that they were afraid to ask the teacher or one of their peers, but then the AI can report back to the teacher, says, hey, I just answered, you just said the word entropy in class. 5 of the kids asked me what entropy means. I just explained it to them, but you might want to slow down a little bit because and give that a little bit more depth. And so the teacher really feels like they're working alongside, and then most of the teacher's energy then goes to what they, I think, entered the profession for, connecting with students, guiding them through really fun experiences. But a lot of the drudgery, like grading papers, creating assignments, writing progress reports, is gone. And from the student's point of view, the drudgery of sitting in a class where you're either lost or you're bored, those days are over, that it's optimally engaging. And, if you fast forward 10 years, then I think, I don't know if the cartoon Magic School Bus has ever gotten to India, but in that cartoon, you have this teacher that the students all go on these field trips in this magic school bus, and the school bus can enter into the circulatory system or the brain or go to another planet or go back in time to ancient Rome. That's not science fiction. You're going to be able to put on one of those Apple headsets or an Oculus, and you're going to be able to go to ancient Rome or Mohenjo-daro and talk to simulations of people of that time. And you can't really imagine. We're already on Conmigo. We have simulations of historical characters. We have simulations of literary characters. So you can imagine within our lifetime, in the next decade, things that seem like Star Trek worthy are going to be in our everyday lives.
So you just described a scenario where education is more inclusive. It is really about learning, and you're bringing back the fun, the joy in learning, where it's about discovery, debate, etc. And it's what you said. It's much more high touch or human centric, because teachers are going to have more time to spend with students rather than with the papers, and that's going to be a fantastic space for our kids to grow up in. So, Sal, thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing these insights with us. Would love to host you in person in India whenever you're visiting, to meet the community, the tech community, the Nasscom community. And thank you for everything you do, and keep inspiring us.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Thanks.
For more content on tech and leadership, subscribe to Nasscom YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.